China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, yesterday, after the Security Council has circulated to it the letter from the British Prime Minister, after that the United Kingdom requested that closed consultations be held. We asked the President of the Security Council to change the format of the meeting and change it from closed consultations to an open briefing. And we did this not without thinking. We did this because we wanted to make sure that everyone should see what is happening here. Because the letter, which contains completely irresponsible statements, in which it is even difficult for me to comment while using diplomatic vocabulary, it contains threats to a sovereign state, towards a permanent member of Security Council, which is at variance with international law and the chapters 2.4 of the UN Charter. I would like to understand the following. Do our British colleagues understand this? And the first question that we want to put is this: why is it that the representatives of the United Kingdom are dragging this issue into the Security Council? And at the same time, they ignore the procedures which London, in line with their own international commitments, has to abide by, namely involving the specialized organizations. We're talking about the use of a toxic chemical on British soil. We see that the answer to this is obvious. The reason this is being dragged into the Security Council, because they do understand that the real experts, the genuine experts on chemical weapons, are in the Hague, and those experts will not be convinced by their arguments. In other words, they are afraid of having a real, genuine, professional discussion of this topic. This shows that the initiators of this meeting are being guided by something completely different. The Russian Federation thinks that it's completely unacceptable to launch unjustified accusations as contained in the letter from Theresa May dated 13th of March to the Secretary General of the UN. It states that we had something to do with the use of toxic agents in Salisbury. And we were given an ultimatum and requested in 24 hours to admit that we committed a crime. In other words, confess. We do not speak the language of ultimatums. We do not use that language with anyone. And we will not allow to be spoken to in that language either. But we are polite. And on the 13th of March, we did send a note to the Foreign Office where we reaffirmed that we had nothing to do with this incident and asked for the samples of the substance being used and also asked for a joint investigation. All the more so since one of the people who impacted was a Russian national. This request was refused. In other words, a hysterical atmosphere is being created by London and also being completely non-transparent in this. We saw today the announcement that Russian diplomats are being expelled and bilateral relations are being frozen. I want to ask my UK colleague whether this applies to the UN as well. We also saw announcements about a prepared cyber attack against Russia. We would like to warn that this will not remain without reaction on our part. We are compelled to make the following conclusion, that the authorities of the UK are interested in finding the truth last. They're guided by something else. They are using the propaganda war ways of recent years, and they are trying to thus influence the public, which is very easy to influence and not well educated. But this does not have any facts without that, other than the unsubstantiated claim that there is a Russian trace in all of this. This is not the first time when Russian nationals in the UK or people from Russia in the UK have their life endangered, where such instances are not investigated or where we're not allowed to become acquainted with such investigations. London should first try and determine what it is happening on their territory before going ahead and accusing others, because that's what polite people do. We would suggest to the British side to immediately involve the procedures in Chapter 9.2 of the Convention on Chemical Weapons, because it provides for requests for explanation and providing answers to the requesting state as quickly as possible, and in any event, no later than 10 days after the request was received. The British colleagues do know about that, but they're in no hurry of invoking the convention which they're party to. We demand that material proof be provided of the allegedly found Russian trace in this high-resonance event. Without this stating that there is incontrovertible truth is not something that we can take into account. And up until now, we have not seen anything besides stating that this is highly likely. In such a situation, it would be legitimate to approach the Technical Secretariat of OPCW and ask them to carry out an independent laboratory analysis that the British authorities, of the samples that the British authorities have. Now, a few words about the chemical side of it. In the Russian Federation, no scientific research or development work under the title Novichok were carried out. Since the beginning of the 1970s, a whole number of countries implemented programs on creating new types of chemical and paralytic agents, in particular in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And this was called VX. In line with a decree by the President of the Russian Federation in 1992, the Soviet developmental work in the area of chemical weapons in Russia were stopped. In 2017, the Russian Federation completed the destruction of all existing stocks of chemical weapons, and this has been verified by the relevant international entity, namely the Organization on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. By the way, the United States has not, to date, destroyed their chemical stockpile. In the middle of the 1990s, the Western Special Services moved to the West a number of our specialists, and their names are well known. And also some documentation was taken out of our country and continued their work in this area, including in the US and the UK. The positive results that they've obtained on creating new chemical agents, which for some reason in the West are classified as Novichok, has been confirmed and reflected in more than 200 open sources of NATO countries, and we do have the reference to that, and we stand ready to provide you with them. The identification per se of the toxic substance used in the incident was carried out in Portsdown, which is a scientific center of the Ministry of Defense. This is the place which was a basis for the development of chemical weapons, including the chemical weapons of this kind. The most probable source origin for this chemical are the countries which have, since the end of the 90s, been carrying out intensive research on these kinds of weapons, including the UK. But we're not chemists here. Let me just quote the opinion of a professional chemist. For the British specialists to be perfectly confident in stating that this gas is a Novichok kind of gas and not any other kind, they need to have the what we call control standard. In order to prove that that is that exact compound, it needs to be compared to a standard. If they state that this gas is a Novichok kind of gas, well, that a priori means that they have a standard for this substance. In other words, they have a collection and they have the formula. And this is the most important point in this whole story. In other words, if the UK is so firmly convinced this is the Novichok gas, then that means that they have the samples of this and they have the formula for this and they're capable of manufacturing that. Mr. President, we are living in very, very special times. In front of our eyes, incredible things are happening. The process of replacing the presumption of innocence with the presumption of guilt is taking place. And this criminal law principle is now being transferred into international relations. And today, Ambassador Haley, as an experienced chemist and an expert in that area, talked today about the crimes committed by Russia. We have known for a very long time that for you, in order to determine who is a guilty party, no investigation is needed. In the letter by the Prime Minister of the UK, it is stated that this is highly likely. But even in this, you have exceeded your reliable ally. If the Soviet prosecutor Vyshinsky thought that confession was the best kind of proof, well, now, using the expression of Minister Lavrov, what is the best kind of proof is suspicion. It is no longer necessary to show to the Council test tubes with unknown white substance in it. It is enough to send a letter which contains an egregious attitude towards a sovereign state. And we are witnessing the same when it comes to Syria. And now Russia is being pushed towards the number of those who are violating the convention. Let me simply remind you about the UK involvement in illegal attacks on independent states, including using unsubstantiated proof. Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya. This led to numerous suffering among civilians. Don't forget that the UK is well known as a state which uses targeted assassinations by drones. And hearing from you invectives against us is something that is odd.
It's 9 hours.
And when there is no proof behind them, it's all the more odd. In jurisprudence and in life in general, there is a principle. The principle qui bono or qui prodest. In other words, look for those for whose benefit this is being done. Well, what do you think? This incident is something that benefits Russia on the eve of presidential elections and the World Football Championship. But I can name a number of countries who are, but abiding by the principle of the presumption of innocence, I will not name them. But I can think of a number of countries who would benefit a great deal from this incident and accusing Russia of it. What do you think? What could be the motivation that the Prime Minister of UK is using that Russia could have for the attempt on Sergei Skripal, who, after the investigation, after he served his sentence, then pardoned and given over to the British, was no longer of any kind of threat to my country. But he is a perfect victim. which could justify any unthinkable lie, any kind of dirt, or any kind of black PR tarnishing Russia. We have stated many a time that anything along those lines, any kind of a provocation before certain events could happen. And today we're witnessing the fact that the authorities of the UK are consciously trying to tarnish Russia, stooping to any low. Arthur Conan Doyle, the British classic, fame for his country and very popular in Russia, has a series of stories about Sherlock Holmes, and he has a hapless character in those stories, Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard.